Imagine this. You've finally saved up enough money to go on a vacation. You search for a plane ticket to your dream destination and settle on the cheapest flight. It's with an airline you've never heard of before, but the price is reasonable, so you purchase your economy class ticket. You arrive at the airport expecting a substandard in-flight experience. But when you board the plane, you're pleasantly surprised to find that your seat has extra legroom. Not only that, but it features lumbar support and has generous pitch. Once you're in the air, a flight attendant comes by and offers you some wine. It appears to be free of charge, so you gladly accept. Soon after, the flight attendant returns to take your order for the dinner service. Your options for the main course are cordon bleu and filet mignon. You make your selection, and then the flight attendant asks how you would like your dish prepared. When your food arrives, it is served on fine china instead of on a plastic tray. You can't believe what you're experiencing, so out of curiosity, you ask the flight attendant if you are mistakenly upgraded to first class. But they smile and answer no. This is how the airline treats all its economy class passengers. Alright, this might sound too good to be true, but such an airline actually did exist. I just described to you what it was like to fly with Wardair, a Canadian carrier that mainly flew charter flights from 1952 to 1989. In this video, I'll be examining the history of Wardair and discussing what led to its failure. Wardair was founded in 1952 by an aviator from Edmonton named Maxwell Ward. The airline started out small, commencing operations in 1953 with a de Havilland Otter, which was used to carry passengers and cargo on charter flights from Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. In its first decade of operations, Wardair stuck to flying in Canada's north, and it slowly acquired more bush planes. Things started to get more interesting for the humble airline in 1962, when Wardair leased its first real airliner, a Douglas DC-6. The range and capacity of the DC-6 opened up new possibilities for Wardair's operations. In 1962, it began charter flights to Europe out of Edmonton, Alberta, becoming Canada's first international charter carrier. Wardair changed its scheduling soon after, opting to fly to Europe during the summer and to Mexico, California, and Florida during the winter. This effectively turned Wardair into one of the world's first leisure carriers. But unlike many leisure carriers that we're familiar with today, Wardair provided its customers with an amazing in-flight experience. Keep in mind that in a time before IFE screens and free Wi-Fi, flying was all about quality meals, hospitable crew members, and comfortable seats. Wardair passengers dined on fine cuisine that was cooked to order on board. Max Ward valued presentation as well, so food was served on Royal Doulton china, which was specifically made for Wardair. Ward figured that going all in on customer service would keep people coming back for more, and he was right. The airline's combination of high-quality service and modest fares started to build Wardair's reputation as a formidable passenger carrier. In 1966, Wardair purchased a used Boeing 727-100, becoming the first 727 operator in Canada. One might assume that Wardair used this 727 on domestic routes, but that wasn't the case. Wardair actually became the first airline in the world to use a 727 on transatlantic flights. Wardair then added a couple Boeing 707s to its fleet in the late 1960s, which allowed the airline to fly non-stop charter routes to Europe and the Caribbean as well. In 1973, Wardair sold its 727 and bought its first Boeing 747 jumbo jet. This achievement was impressive to say the least, considering the airline's fleet had consisted of only a handful of bush planes just 12 years prior. Regardless, Ward wasn't satisfied with just one 747, so he scooped up a gently used example from Continental Airlines in 1975 and gutted its interior to replace it with his own. Why? Well, because it simply wasn't up to his standards. It's worth noting that this behavior is very uncharacteristic of a charter carrier, but Wardair was a one-of-a-kind airline. The 1970s saw Wardair expand its network into more lucrative markets, like Toronto and Vancouver, but Edmonton still remained one of its hubs. From these Canadian cities, Wardair started flying to Hawaii, becoming the first Canadian airline to do so. The airline found great success on the islands, and eventually came to carry more passengers to and from Hawaii than any other airline. With profits increasing, the airline's fleet grew steadily. McDonnell Douglas DC-10s and 2 more Boeing 747s were added to Wardair's fleet during the decade. Wardair's 707s were sold in 1978, and in 1979, Wardair shut down its Yellowknife operations due to a lack of demand for air travel up north. However, it would continue to operate bush planes up until 1985. By 1980, Wardair had become Canada's 3rd largest airline and was a major player in the international market. Wardair's network had grown to include destinations like Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Glasgow, and even Cardiff, Wales. Around this time, the airline built a new maintenance facility at Toronto Pearson International Airport, which became the largest of its kind in the world. By now you can see that Wardair was enjoying success in the holiday travel market, and although the golden age of air travel had passed, Wardair still remained committed to providing customers with high-quality service, which was comparable to first-class service on scheduled airlines. It's no wonder then that Wardair was named the world's best airline by Forbes magazine at the time, and received the prestigious International Service Award 4 years in a row from the International Air Transport Association. That's right, a small Canadian charter airline outclassed the likes of Swissair, Singapore Airlines, and Cathay Pacific in 4 consecutive years. But despite all the recognition that Wardair was getting, there was a storm brewing on the horizon. Canada's economic recession of the early 1980s spelled the beginning of the end for Wardair. Fewer people were booking vacations, and the cost of fuel was on the rise. Wardair started to rack up debt. Max Ward realized this, and decided that the only way his airline could be saved was by becoming a scheduled carrier like Air Canada and CP Air. However, this transformation would take time. Wardair could not turn into a scheduled carrier overnight because the Canadian airline industry was heavily regulated by the federal government at the time. The industry's regulation had created an environment where Air Canada and CP Air effectively had a duopoly on scheduled flights in and out of major Canadian cities. So, Ward began lobbying the government to deregulate the industry, and after years of bureaucratic battles, he finally got his way. In 1986, Wardair was granted a license to operate domestic flights, and was finally able to compete with Air Canada and CP Air. Licenses for international flights soon followed, but these changes did not help the company turn a profit. That's because Wardair was granted limited slots at airports, not just in Canada, but at international destinations as well. Moreover, the few slots it did receive were at inconvenient times for passengers, since the prime slots were owned by larger carriers. To make matters even worse, Wardair was facing intense competition from its domestic rivals. CP Air even began undercutting Wardair, and stated that it would continue to do so until the smaller company surrendered. By 1987, the overall situation at Wardair was dire. With a fleet of only 7 aircraft and dwindling profits, Ward made one last attempt to save his company. Wardair sold its aging DC-10s and replaced them with 3 Airbus A300s, becoming the first Canadian operator of the type. Then it ordered 12 McDonnell Douglas MD-80s and 12 Fokker 100s to enhance its domestic network capabilities. Wardair also ordered 14 Airbus A310s so that international flights could be operated more frequently. But unfortunately, this rapid expansion led to more financial difficulties. In 1988, Wardair started reducing flights to Europe and introduced a business class product for the first time in an effort to attract more customers. But all of these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. In 1989, Wardair was sold outright to CP Air's parent company, PWA Corporation, for $250 million. Wardair ceased operations soon after, and its assets were absorbed into Canadian Airlines International, formerly CP Air, in 1990. But if PWA had waited just a little while longer, it would have gotten a much better deal. Because on the day that Wardair was sold, The airline was just 2 weeks away from declaring bankruptcy. Unbeknownst to PWA, Wardair was over $700 million in debt at the time, and was losing upwards of $1 million every day. Unfortunately, this immense debt also contributed to the downfall of Canadian Airlines just 10 years later. What went wrong here? Why did Wardair fail? Well, Wardair wasn't just a victim of circumstance. It contributed to its own downfall in more ways than one, as I will now explain. First of all, the airline did not manage its finances effectively, and although the airline prospered in the 1970s, it was not able to cope with the Canadian recession that began in 1981. The executives at Wardair believed that if people are spending their hard-earned cash to travel, then they ought to get their money's worth in terms of treatment. This consumer-oriented philosophy was a significant contributor to Wardair's failure, because as you might have guessed, the combination of low fares and high expenses wasn't exactly a recipe for a sustainable business. Wardair was operating at an annual average yield of 8 cents per passenger per mile. That's hardly scraping by. Wardair should have adapted to the changing economy by cutting costs, but it chose not to, because Ward valued quality, and the last thing he wanted was for his airline to fall short of consumer expectations. So he kept serving fine wines and cordon bleu to passengers, despite the fact that the walls were closing in on his company. Max Ward figured that becoming a scheduled carrier would fix his airline's financial situation, although some people were skeptical of Ward's decision to venture into the scheduled market. After all, the charter business was Wardair's bread and butter. But Ward admitted that his airline was actually not successful in the charter business because there was apparently no money in it. The only way that Wardair generated serious income, he claimed, was by selling used aircraft at a profit. So that's why Ward became determined to compete in the big leagues in order to make a recovery. But Wardair's competitors weren't just giants. They were protected by the government. You see, Air Canada was a crown corporation at the time, and CP Air was part of Canada's largest conglomerate, Canadian Pacific Limited. There was barely enough room in Canada for both Air Canada and CP to operate at a profit, so the government was hesitant to let another player into the market. That being said, when the industry was finally deregulated, Air Canada, CP Air, and the government showed no mercy in trying to put Wardair out of business. Every route and every slot that Wardair wanted had to be battled for with the feds, which proved to be a significant barrier to the airline's success. Max Ward's decision to expand his airline's operations so rapidly also contributed to the company's increased debt load. All of the aircraft needed new crew members, and of course the payments still had to be made. While this expansion may have paid off over time, time was something that Wardair did not have. Wardair had always struggled to attract business customers. Over time, must-fly travelers became loyal to Air Canada and CP, as they had designated business class products and frequent flyer programs. Wardair did not. It's important to note that scheduled airlines make the bulk of their profits off high-paying business class customers, so when Ward entered the scheduled market, he had to get a slice of that action. However, Wardair's small network and newly established reward program weren't enough to lure business travelers away from the large carriers. As a result, Wardair missed out on the critical revenue that comes from business class customers. There were a host of smaller operational problems that adversely affected Wardair as well. First of all, the airline did not have a feeder network to connect passengers to its hubs. Secondly, its aircraft were too large for the scheduled routes it was trying to fly. Imagine using a 747 on a flight from Montreal to Puerto Plata. That's a bit excessive, considering that Air Transat flies A320s on that route today. I suppose that Wardair's new aircraft would have alleviated that issue, but still, that's just basic economics. In retrospect, some of Wardair's charter routes didn't make sense either. I can't imagine a DC-10 from Ottawa to Fort Lauderdale, or from Saskatoon to Honolulu, being very full. A third problem arose in Wardair's computer reservation system. It was far too outdated and inefficient, and could not process customer information as quickly as Canadian Airlines and Air Canada's systems could. Ward admitted that his computer systems were in need of so many upgrades that it would have taken at least 4 years to bring them up to par with other carriers. Overall, Wardair's demise was a direct result of its risky business model. When a financial obstacle finally came around in the form of a recession, the airline found itself on a slippery slope to bankruptcy. Wardair probably could have saved itself if it weren't for the government's intervention in the Canadian airline market at the time. Thankfully, though, competition is welcome nowadays, so no Canadian airline will have to endure such unnecessarily strong headwinds again. When all was said and done, Ward kept the dream of 1950s-style flying alive for 36 years, leaving a lasting impression on millions of travelers and cementing its place in aviation history. After Wardair stopped flying, its Royal Dalton China continued to be served in Empress class aboard Canadian Airlines. Canadian Airlines also took ownership of Wardair's hangar complex at Toronto Pearson, which was destroyed in 2001 to make room for runway 24 left. As for the airplanes, Canadian Airlines kept Wardair's remaining 747s, but got rid of its A310s and cancelled all outstanding orders. 5 of Wardair's A310s were acquired by the Royal Canadian Air Force, where they continue to serve as aerial refueling tankers and VIP transports under the CC-150 Polaris designation. Even to this day, you'll still encounter people who testify that Wardair was the best airline they've ever flown with. Given the way the airline treated its clientele, it's easy to see why. There will never be another airline quite like Wardair. Modern carriers can barely afford to serve cold-cut sandwiches to economy class passengers, let alone the steak and champagne that Wardair provided. It's really a shame that Wardair went under, because it was a fantastic airline. However, it failed to survive as a business in the cutthroat aviation industry. There's a lot to be said about Max Ward himself. He pioneered the charter airline segment and successfully fought for airline deregulation in Canada. Ward passed away in November of 2020, prompting some people to petition for Edmonton International Airport to be renamed in his honor. It would be a fitting tribute to the Canadian aviation legend and a suitable nod to one of the greatest air carriers the world has ever seen.